All right, so what did I get? I got this error that says, hey, no module named simple JSON, right? And what does that tell me? It tells me that I don't have this library installed on my computer, but the code base is using it. And to quickly get this stuff, I have a requirements.txt file, and this has the simple JSON in the file, right? So if I want to install this, it's something like pip3 install -r. Is that right? -r? I think it is. Requirements.txt. So it's normally, this is the library, right, that we're using, pip3, or yeah, pip3. This is the command that we're using of this library, and then comes the flag, right? And then finally, like the what we're calling, like the file name. All right, so you can see this is installing our various libraries, including simple JSON down here. And then we'll try this again. I expect probably to get another error, and I am. So this is pretty cool. So it's telling me I'm missing an argument, LL. So essentially what I'm doing is this Python3 manage.py. It uses this library called click. Okay? And what click allows you to do is essentially call a function, right? Call the build venues function from the command line, from the terminal, right? Normally we're not able to do that. Normally I have to do Python3-i, right? Get into interactive mode and then call it. But here you can kind of like, you don't have to even use Python. You can just use the command line. And that's, oftentimes it's a bit easier. It means you don't have to like explore your code base. Say this was deployed on AWS. You can just kind of connect to AWS machine and run this by just typing these words. It will maybe make more sense when we get to AWS. But you can see that what it's telling us is we're missing an argument LL. Where is that coming from? This function takes two arguments, LL and category. And it looks like we're specifying, hey, this is the function that we're able to call, build venues. And these are the arguments it takes is LL, right? And another one for category. So, and it says, hey, try manage.py build venues help for help. Let's see if that helps us. So we do -- help. I guess I have to delete this. Nah, it doesn't work. Oh well. All right, let's just Google it. We probably can do this. An argument name is -ll, and then maybe here we put a value. For instance, this 40.7. Right, put this in the quotation marks. Oh man. Let's Google it. Okay, click Python arguments. Okay, so here we're passing through an argument, and then here we call it, and it looks like here they're passing through the argument. So here they're not really using named arguments. They're just, it seems like you can maybe just pass it through. So maybe I can just do this. Okay, that's great. So now look at the error. It's no longer saying we're missing an argument for LL, but now we're just missing an argument for category. So this is just, we need two arguments. And I think that we just have to put, it looks like we just have to put a space. Like there's no commas. It's just a space. So the sample here is tacos. So what this will do, I think, is call the build venues function from the command line, passing through the location, longitude and latitude as the first argument, and then category as the second argument. And let's just see if it works, I suppose. I'm not quite sure what database, when it works, it probably should seed my database somehow. But we'd have to look at, yeah, this is interesting, right? We'd have to look at the settings.py, and this uses a .m file that doesn't exist. So it'll probably break. All right, so it seems to break. But not for the reason we thought, right? API.source.adapters has no attribute client. Yeah, well, I wasn't expecting this. Um, but anyway, maybe we can debug this, but I did want to show you, like, this is a broader code base. You can start to see how to interact with it, and this is like the entry point to it. And what I would do, beyond trying to actually get it working, is trace it throughout, right? Like, this is one entry point to the application, and it's like request and build. What does request and build do? Well, we initialize the new request and build object, and then we call run here, passing through like a longitude and latitude and a category, right? And then now we go look at this and look at the run function. So this init seems to create a client, a builder, and a cursor, whatever these things are. We can kind of take a guess. We've seen these names before, right? Client, remember, like, kind of makes our request, and that kind of makes sense in a request and build class. That here, this probably makes the request. That takes care of the request part. And then build it seems like, was like our adapter that takes the data and turns it into instances. So that's what I guess this does. So we first initialize this request and build, and then we call run. Okay, so then it's the next question. What does that do? Right? We go through these steps. The reason why, like, part of the reason why I bring this up, like, really, this is not really an exercise in Python or like the pattern, like, I guess a little bit the pattern, but really what it's an exercise in is like reading a code base, because when you join a project, you're working with code that's already been there before you, and sometimes no one that wrote the code is left on the team, right? So you just have to, you are figuring it out. And I remember when I first joined a team, they'd ask me to make contributions, and I'd be like, well, I can make contributions because I don't know what's going on here. And they'd be like, well, we don't know what's going on either. We're reading the code. It's like opening up a new book, right? Or doing research on a new topic. You start just piecing things together. And I'm trying to show you like a strategy for doing that, which is start from like the entryways of it and then just read through the steps and try to not only understand the code, but understand, like, again, almost like how it's solving that problem, right? Use okay, here we're in the details of it, but that makes sense because of something a little bit broader, right? Like going back to the big picture as a way to confirm your understanding, and then just following the trace all the way down, right? Because this looks similar. Self.client.request venues, right? I'll maybe, go to the client, look at request venues, but you can also take a guess, right? Like, what do you think this does? We've seen this before, right? Probably makes a request. What do you think this is? Probably a list of dictionaries. Here we're getting out the IDs from each of those dictionaries, storing them, going through each ID, making a request to each venue, and now it seems like here we're calling run to actually, right, like turn each dictionary into an instance and probably saving it somewhere. So you might want to confirm that, but that's kind of already, we're getting an overview, right? And if we want to go into more details, we'd look at these functions. So this is like one, right, thing. Remember that, like, to search for different files, you can press Command P, right, and look for, like, let's say you want to look for the venue file. Press Command P, type in venue.py, right? So Command P is very helpful. It also tells you that naming your files in a consistent manner is really helpful, because if I see a venue class, or I know there's a venue class, that means how am I going to find that thing? Remember, the code base could have thousands of files in it. It's very helpful if we name them following a pattern, right? A strict pattern, okay? Where when the class is capital venue, the name is venue, right? If you want to see, like, hey, where is venue being used in the code base? You can press Command-Shift-F, right? And now over on the right here, you can see the different places it's being used. This seems not specific enough, right? It's venue, but it's including def, like build venues. Maybe I want to look at just where the class is being initialized. So I'm putting the parentheses at the end here to, like, narrow it down. And now you can see, actually, it's not being used very often. It's being used here in venue.py, right? Bingo. So just declaring the class. Test the client, I guess. And then test the client maybe here. Here we request a venue, and then probably somewhere here. Oh, this isn't even right. So I guess, I don't know, I don't really see it. I wonder if in the build file there's anything about building a venue. Maybe not. Right? Like I would have expected to see it here. That there's something about, but we don't really do it that way. Here because we call models.venue. And you know what the issue was? I did the closing parentheses. So when I looked for it, I should actually be doing this. Venue, opening parentheses. Right? Because if I do the closing parentheses, that assumes there's no arguments in it. Right? So I can, like now we can start to see where this thing is being used. Right? Like why is this useful? Here we're just saving some data. I wonder if you can do capitalization. We can. So now I'm just searching for capital venue to make it a little bit more specific, right? And these are, you can see these are the files over to the right, and underneath it has the actual line. So that's kind of interesting. These are all tests. We can kind of ignore them. This is more tests. Here's declaring it. And then this looks like, this is my venue builder. venuesbuilder.py, right? So this is actually the only place that we're using it. Is here's the venues.py, and then here's where it seems like we're creating our venues. So it's pretty like right. Like if I want to see why is this thing useful, how is this tool being used, right? You can search for it throughout your entire code base, and then start to narrow down, right, where it's being used. So we talked about one place, right, said like kind of start at the entry points. And for this, at least, the entry point was the manage.py file. Maybe even this. look at this word, entry point.sh. And what this does is this is a bash command that you can just call like bash, I think, entry point.sh. And then that calls Python 3 manage.py. This -h is like for localhost port 80. And it calls the run function. Interesting. What's the run function? The run function might be, I don't know if it's this. I'm not sure. I have to see. It probably is just this CLI thing, whatever this is. Oh, what it probably does is this CLI thing gets called, and then that calls create app. And then where does create app come from? Right. Well, we can follow our little breadcrumbs to say create app comes from api.source, right? And then we can go there, api.source. So source, if it's api.source, we know that should be the init file, right? Because that's really where things at the module level are declared, is on the init file. And now here, okay, so what does this probably do? The run function called, initialize, probably boots up our Flask application, which makes sense. That's normally what we use run for. And here this seems like another kind of key file, right? /venues/venue/search. That's a little different, right? And notice that this /venue/search seems to call this search function, which seems kind of interesting. We haven't seen this before. And I guess it says, hey, if you don't pass through any like specifications to search on, just return all the venues. Otherwise, start to execute, right? Execute is the SQL query, the search clause, and then maybe you look more into that. And this is like a lot of code, I guess, to look through, but I tried to implement search as best as I could. And this was during COVID, so everyone's brain was, anyway, just forgive me if it's messed up. So yeah, I mean, the point is, like, I want you to, this is a little bit of a larger code base than your code base. One other thing to note that I did not bring up is this seed.py file. It might. So just in general, the seed.py file, it looks like this one might not be in a fully working state. I'm not sure. But the seed.py file is used to seed your database, meaning fill your database with some sample data. So this way, I think some of you all asked about that, like your database is empty. How do you fill it with some data? In the other database, in the other lab as well. Hold on. There, in that lab, the Foursquare multiple models, if you go to backend, there is a seed.py file that you can see here, right? And what it does is similar, right? It creates a venue, saves it to the database, creates, right, a few venues, creates a few venue categories, creates, so this is, and probably creates a couple categories as well. So it gives you some sample data for you to work with in there. And all you have to do is run Python 3 seed.py, and that will run this code, right? And save things to the database. So that's, right, that's also useful just to get started. Why make sample data instead of just making a call to the API in this case? Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. Like in this case, you probably can just call the API, you know? And I do that sometimes. So I think that's a good question. In other applications, let's say where the user is filling out a form, if you think about like Twitter, right? Where the user, and we want to analyze some of Twitter's data, right? Or pretend to, or build out an application that can. Well, what do we need? We actually need Twitter to go live, and we need some real data, like user data. So one, we may not have that, right? Two, maybe some of that information is like personal or private, and we don't want our whole dev team or anyone from our dev team accessing real user information. So instead what we'll do is we'll create sample data, right? Like for instance, well, one domain that's very useful, right? You can see I used it in one of the labs, is The Simpsons. Like I worked with a social service organization. It was managing, caseworkers, right? For like adopted children and things like that. Well, obviously we don't, we're not storing real children or their casework. We're not storing real information there, but we use The Simpsons, because then lots of people know that domain pretty well, that Marge has, Bart and Lisa, etc. So you basically had the whole Simpsons like community in the seed file, and it worked really well because of all the relationships that exist there, and etc. So yeah, it's good sometimes. Lots of times, just you'll have like a sample data file. You can also run your Flask app while you're in a breakpoint. That's true. You can run your Flask app while in a breakpoint, but I don't know if you can. Maybe you can, Brian, actually have it send back. Like I was having a hard time with the Flask application, right? If we go to, where are we? If we go to this multiple models, right? And then let's take a look. If I run, I have a run, if you look at this run.py file, let's close this down for a second. So right now I want to go back to the lab. If you look at the run.py file, right, this creates the app. Oh man, I need to charge my, okay. And then it calls app.run. We just have to make sure you actually have some data in your database here. I don't think the test data will cut it oftentimes, because what the test data is seeding, is really creating data for, is your test database oftentimes, and not your development database. So oftentimes when we connect to the database, we want it in our development database. Remember, with our test database, our procedure is when we have tests, we will oftentimes remove all the data first, then create some sample data, then remove it again, right? So I get why Brian's saying, hey, in the middle of a test, right, we probably can do it. But because we tend to clean our database, for that reason, with the tests, for that reason, we normally use a separate test database to like create the data and then drop it. This way, when we have a development database that actually has some sample information in it that we can mess around with, right? Whereas our test database stays clean unless we're running a test. Okay, so this is why normally you can seed your development database, and then the question is, all right, if I run Python 3 run.py, and remember the run.py file, that creates an application and then runs it, or boot it up here, And now let's go to the init, not that one. This is under tests. We want to go to API init.py and maybe go to /venues, right? Right here, I did actually use some data, I guess, from the API. But the other thing I could do is do Python 3, seed.py. And what would that do? That would actually, create some venues, etc., save them to the database. What database is it saving to? Well, you can look at the connection. Connection is going to this scopg2 database name, and the database name is coming from settings. And in settings, it's, oops, I went to the wrong file. In settings, it's coming from our .env file. So this database name comes from the .env, and the .env says the database name is Foursquare Development. So it's loading our Foursquare Development database. So the c.py file is loading our Foursquare Development database, and that's probably what this Flask app is looking for data from. So that seems to be good. Okay, so anyway, in terms of reading a database, things to kind of look at that we've talked about, or reading a code base, I should say. Things to look at that we've talked about is Foursquare. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you go over what the that search thing was again? What was it? Control shift something?
Sure. So for this search, how to find Command Shift F to search through?
Yes.
Yes. So you can press Command Shift F to search through the entire code base, right? And then you just have to be careful about having a specific and doing the right level of detail in the search. So you can see for me I'm typing in venue, and then I want it to be only capitalized, not this one. So I can do capital A, and now this looks a little bit better. And you can see this is in multiple files, 18 results in 10 files. So you can start to minimize some of these if they don't look very good. Or these are tests, right?
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So Jeff, manage.py is entry point for backend. You can say for the developers, right?
Yes. Yeah, you can.
And then init.py is entry point for the users.
Yeah, I think a better way of putting that is, I'll just do this in a whiteboard. If we think about our application as this ETL, right, where we have the client. I'll fill in the names in a second. Right, the client. Then this goes to an adapter. And then this goes to a model. Right? This is our ETL process. Where we're loading the database. We're hitting, I'll just fill this in now. Client, adapter, model. What's the whole point here with ETL? Is, hey, we don't have anything in our database, or we want more in our database. What do we have to do? We have to fill our database with information from an external resource like an API, right? Like the Foursquare API in the cloud, right? Down into our database and create new rows of data. So that is the entry point for that kind of ties everything together, is the manage.py. Right, which we'll call that create a client, create an create a client, request venues, take those messy venues, turn them into pretty instances, save them to the database. Then, to make this useful to maybe other users or other people that want to hit our database, what do? We have the MVC, right? So this is still our data layer, and then we have a controller. Right, and a user gets to make a request. This is me drawing a browser from their browser to the controller, and it has the routes, right, /venues. So this is the controller. And right, we know that our controller sends back JSON, which is the view. So what's the entry point, like what's the file to look at here? Well, that's the init.py file, right? So you're right, these two files, this one is controlling the ETL process, the manage.py, and then this file, the init.py, or wherever the create app is, right? That's controlling the kind of the Flask app and the routes, right? And the user, these routes are what allow the users to make a request that then ultimately pulls data from the database and then sends it back to the user. Okay, so these are two, you're right, these are two key files to look at, manage.py, init.py. What's another key file I would, sorry, before moving on, does that make sense to everyone, or any questions about that?
Client and user both making requests. So because their client is making from cloud and user is making from web browser.
Yeah.
So
What's the point? Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Because both are making requests.
Well, this is loading data. I mean, right now this is loading data from Foursquare, but like ideally your application does something more than just pull data from Foursquare and give it back to other users. So normally what you'll do is maybe you'll have a client, right, that pulls data from Foursquare, and maybe you also have a client that pulls data from, Yelp, right? And so now we have a larger database of data, and maybe we use the ratings from Foursquare and Yelp as a way to provide even better ratings, right? So it's like we kind of haven't done that, but you can imagine that your application has to then, because we're just basically we are just kind of taking the data and giving it back to people, but you can imagine that in taking in this data, then maybe you run some sort of rating system that provides your better rating, or maybe you take the user data and user search history to provide recommendations, or that's where your application really starts adding user value, right? Is by taking this data, adding something to it, whether it's from another data source or some sort of machine learning on it, or just some sort of whatever personalization, right? And then when the user queries it, well, they're getting the value added that your application's providing. Right? So this init.py is to query your application. This client.py is to query outside APIs, right? It's to query Foursquare's application, Yelp's application, Google Place's application, right? But then ideally you're doing something on top of it, right? You're providing some sort of value added in between. And honestly, just cleaning the data, cleaning and combining data is enough work. It is a substantial amount of work. You all will find that out. Right. Okay, that's true. Some applications do just redisplay data, and you can probably name some. Kumar's giving the example of some weather apps, but probably even some Fortune 500 companies are right just create clones of applications. That's fair. But yeah, this is external. This client is for external APIs. This init.py is to allow a browser to hit your API, your application, right? Okay, so there we identified two files that are pretty key, right? The manage.py file, the init.py file. A third file that I think is pretty key is the migrations file. Why is that key? Because it tells you the structure of the, right? This create table file tells you the structure of the database. And from there, I would look at, we talked about this before, look at the foreign keys, right? And specifically tables that have a lot of foreign keys as a way to, I would make a note of them, or I would draw this out, right? We talked about draw out the diagrams. People call that UML, Universal Modeling Language, right? But you can start to see venues, not really any foreign keys here, even though it seems so important. States, no foreign keys. Cities, okay, a city belongs to a state. Zip code. Location, this seems to have a lot. Notice it has a venue and a zip code here and kind of this longitude and latitude. So maybe take note of that a venue location belongs to a venue. And we have a zip code. In this category, and beyond the category, we have venue categories. This seems pretty important, right? Because it tells you that we have a many-to-many relationship where a category has many venues, right? Every time we have like category ID 1 and a separate venue, venue 1, category ID 1, venue 2, right? It's saying this category has many venues. And the opposite, we can have venue 1 has category 1 and venue 1 has category 2, right? So a venue can have many categories. Category can have many venues. Venue can have many categories. So that's pretty valuable. Now, just remember, like in this process, I think there was some confusion about this. This ETL, when we're in this zone, what are we doing? We're loading data, right? Client, adapter to model, right? We're loading data into the database. When we're in this zone, I should put like we're saving, we're storing, inserting data. Maybe that's a better way. We're inserting data into the database, right? So you can think of the database almost as could be starting off as empty, and now we have to, begin creating all the rows. In this case, what are we doing? We're querying the data that already exists, okay? So where did that kind of confusion show up sometimes? In the lab, there, if you look at, I think it's in the adapters, like the venue builder, right? We see, does this venue already exist? If it doesn't exist, we have to right? We're in the builder. We're in the ETL process. So this is all about inserting data. So models venue, save it, right? That kind of makes sense. This inserts a new venue. Now, this category thing, what are we doing? We first, if you look at the run function, we first create the categories, right? And then we create the venue categories. Oh no. Sorry, I thought my power's going out. But so far I'm sort of surviving. Okay, so we first create the categories, and then we create the venue categories. So this is creating a list of the categories, saving them in the database. This is creating a link, right? That join table, the records between the venues. We're linking up the venues and the categories in the database. I actually illustrated this in the lab, or before class I started trying to do this, because what I did was I put a breakpoint in this category builder, okay? So you can see what we've done so far. If we hit our breakpoint, we're like right here. I ran manage.py, okay? And what's going to happen? This is our ETL process, right? So we're requesting data from the cloud, right, from the API. We are then going through each one of these, dictionaries one by one, creating our venue builder. So at this point, what happens? It creates a record in the database of a venue. If I go to my database, do I have it? Sorry, I just want to go to my database. So I'll go to my database, which is PSQL-D Foursquare development. Okay, and we can do select all from venues. We can see we have one venue here. Why do we have one venue here? Because we have run this code about taking JSON data and creating a venue. Then we've hit the next thing, create a category. We've gone to builder.run, and we have done the find categories line. So if I look at select, I'm in the wrong thing. If I look at select all from categories, this should give me all the categories, right, that are related to that tacos al pastor. However, we did not yet get to create venue categories. So what that means is if we want to see the link, right, currently we have select all from venues, right? And we have select all from categories. But if I want to see, like, how does a venue relate to a category, like, right, I'm going to have to basically give me all the categories where the venue categories dot venue ID equals this thing's ID, right? That's what this thing has to create that link. This thing says, hey, take the venue, store the venue ID, and take the category ID. So until I run this code, there is no, you can see, right? There are no venue categories yet. Like there is no link between venue and categories because currently we're right here. We have not yet linked up that Los Tacos Al Pastor to that category number 9. In order to do that, we have to run this code, which is going to create a venue category like instance and then save each of those venue category instances. And when you save it, right, that's what calls the insert into the table, right? And at that point, we'll have some links between it. So if I press continue here, right, now maybe, and I do select all from venue category, now we have the link, right? Category ID, venue ID. This was the taco places, and venue ID 19 was this thing, was this Los Tacos Al Pastor. So this is, now we have this venue related to this category. And that's the goal, right? That makes sense. So this is, if you think about our ETL, what's going on is we already created the categories. We had already created the venues, create the venue. Then we call run here, create the categories. And now the other step was create the link, create the venue category rows that you see here. So that's what we had to do at this point. All right. Right, this is all about creating every row, basically all the data in the database and saving it there. Then at a later point in time, the user can come by and they can say, hey, give me the venue, select all the venues from the database, and when we call toJSON, let's go to the venue class, toJSON, not only give me, turn that that venue into a dictionary, but also get all the categories. Go call select all from categories, and remember what this does is use that join table, right? Use those links that we loaded in from ETL to find the related categories. Okay? So in other words, I saw a couple people try to, in creating the venue categories, like call venue.categories, but that's not going to work, right? Because there is no data in the data. Like that data is not in the database yet. We're getting the data from the API in the ETL process and inserting it into the database. Then at a later point in time, right, that's when we can now query our database, right, after it's already saved in there, and send back that information to the user. Let me get my cord. I'll get my power cord, and you guys can think of questions